Welcome to the Blue Mountains Dharma Center. I'm Scott Anderson, originator of Alignment Yoga, and this here is my assistant, Buddy Cat, and we'd like to talk today about the pelvic floor. Last week I wrote in my blog about the pelvic floor and talked about some of the misconceptions in how people are brought to awareness in the pelvic floor and are taught to tone the pelvic floor. And in this video I'd like to offer a step-by-step progression so that anybody can start to work the pelvic floor and start to gain the benefits therein. Now, a perfectly legitimate question is to ask ourselves, why would I care about the pelvic floor? Why is that important to me? The muscles of the pelvic floor are going to provide almost immediate benefit to your posture. If you have healthy tone in the pelvic floor, the muscles not too tight, not too loose, but just the right tone, you're going to have effortless, very elegant, regal posture. If the pelvic floor muscles are too loose or the pelvic floor muscles are too tight, not only is your posture going to suffer, but a whole host of other health concerns ride on the coattails of that imbalance. An example being very common in men, very often their pelvic floor muscles, they're too tight. So not only do the hips show up as being very tight, but a pelvic floor that's very, very tight doesn't yield under the weight, under the pressure of the bladder. And for a male body, that's a problem because between the pelvic floor and the bladder, there sits the prostate gland. And how many men we all know are having problems with their prostate gland? We see for women, very often there'll be a pelvic floor that needs more tone. The muscles are too slack. And that very often is a predictor of having stress incontinence. And how many women we know in our lives that are challenged by an unexpected laugh, a sneeze, a movement, and it becomes very inconvenient at the wrong place and the wrong time. So to have more tone in the pelvic floor is going to help a whole lot of women to be rid of that problem of stress incontinence. So the healthy tone of the pelvic floor is going to benefit everybody's posture. For people who have a very tight pelvic floor, it's really common in men, it's going to help the hips open up. It's also going to give a lot more space, a lot better blood flow to that prostate gland. People whose pelvic floor is too slack, very common with women who've given birth, getting more tone in that pelvic floor is going to go a long ways to helping to smooth out and to make more predictable the flow of urine. And speaking of the pelvic floor, it can be useful to know the anatomy of the pelvis. We often use the term pelvic bowl. The pelvic bowl is going to describe this part of the body right here. As you see here, this is a fairly incomplete bowl. If this was a bowl full of cookie dough, most of the cookie dough would right now be on the floor. So when we speak of pelvic floor, we see that the bones create the suggestion of a bowl. But what completes the bowl is going to be soft tissue, specifically muscles. We've got the muscles of the lower belly right here, very important for good posture. And we see that we've got the pelvic floor musculature right down here, which helps create the containment for the pelvic bowl. When people talk about toning the pelvic floor, very often they talk about tucking the tailbone, which is an unfortunate instruction. Tucking the tailbone only works a very small percentage of the pelvic floor muscles. Tucking the tailbone also has a negative effect on the spine. When you tuck the tailbone, you end up flattening the curve of the lower back. And by distorting the curve of the lower back, you send strain all the way up to the spine that's going to be most often felt right at the base of the skull. In the Alignment Yoga Teacher Training Program, one of the jokes we talk about is that if you want to send someone home with a neck ache that doesn't show up for 4 or 5 years, teach them how to tuck the tailbone at present time. It's just enough strain in the body that over time, enough tucking the tailbone is going to put a stress in the system that leads to having a neck ache. There's much better ways to get to the pelvic floor than by tucking the tailbone. And in the upcoming video, we're going to talk about how to use the sumo pose to exercise the majority of the pelvic floor muscles without having to put strain in any other part of the body. And that's what we call win-win alignment, where we get the best of both worlds, benefiting all the parts of the body. Thanks for joining Buddy and I at the Blue Mountains Dharma Center, and I hope you'll join us for the next video about the sumo pose for accessing the pelvic floor.